bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another video in my Apollo Moon Hoax series. This is actually my first video of 2025, and I can think of no one better than to share that video experience with my good friend and colleague here and all knowing about the Apollo Moon Hoax, Marcus Allen. Marcus, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Randy. It's always great to be chatting with you. Because
we have some very good chats, I must admit.
Well, let's hope we can continue because there's lots to talk about, as ever.
Yeah. And I just want to let the audience know that my friend Marcus here just had a recent birthday. So happy birthday, Marcus.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to let all the viewers know that I myself just had a recent birthday. I'm now officially a member of the Seniors Club. So all of you critics out there need to go a little easier on me when you're posting comments, right? Keep it nice, keep it civilized.
Yes.
And respect your elders out there. So anyway, so happy birthday to you, Marcus.
Thank you very much. Nice to get another birthday in the bag. You know, I can speak from experience.
And you do indeed. Absolutely, you do indeed. And I was just watching a recent interview with Bart Sabril on Rumble. He was on Nino Rodriguez's show. And it was about an hour or so, and they were talking about some very interesting things. They touched on some of the subjects that you have been working on, along with Robert and Scott, of course. So we'll probably end up getting into some of that. But for now, I just want to let the viewers know that we're going to continue now with discussing Marcus's book. Now, the thing with Marcus's book here, The Apollo Moon Hoax, thank you, Marcus, for holding that up. The Real Evidence, that's also co-written with Trevor Weaver. And what I want to emphasize here in this video series is that, as I mentioned before, we don't do, I don't do the graphics. What I do is I'll post this video on my channel, then I send it to Robert, and Robert actually will post the graphics for you for people who want to see the visual. You know, I'm not as adept in these video editing as I'd like to be. I spend a lot of time writing and researching, so maybe I'll get around to that. But what we'll do is we're picking about 2 or 3 salient points from each of the chapters in this book. We're going to be starting today with chapter 9, and then we'll discuss that, and we'll discuss what we're talking about in terms of the visual stuff, so as to give you some idea, you know, a better picture. But you'll certainly see this on the Apollo Detectives channel when Robert does his brilliant editing on that. So anyway, Marcus, are you all set to go? I thought we would start now. We continue on with chapter 9.
Chapter 9, yeah, that's good.
Chapter 9.
The fake Apollo sons.
Fake Apollo sons, and this is actually a very, apart the pun, hot topic for individuals out there. So I would like to start with the first paragraph. Now, the thing with this is that does, you know, you have just envision in your mind, folks. You can also go to Google. You can Google any of these photos. The whole Apollo photographic record is online anyway, so you can Google that as well and help go along with the narrative here. So I'm going to read the first paragraph on page 71. That is the first paragraph in chapter 9, The Fake Apollo Sons. And starting now, perhaps one of the most difficult challenges for the perpetrators of the fake was modeling the sun. The luminosity of the sun is about 1,000 times brighter than a 100-watt light bulb at a distance of 3 meters, so it would require some very powerful lights. This amount of wattage, perhaps 100,000 watts, would produce a lot of heat, which would require some significant cooling if the astronaut actors were to be able to perform adequately in their spacesuits. It could well be that this cooling was the source of the flag movements we discussed earlier. Now, that's a very interesting paragraph because there's actually 2 issues in that paragraph. Number 1 is the sun, and number 2 is the wag flaving. The wag flaving. Did I say flaving?
Flaving.
Yeah, interesting. Eh? Yeah, flapping. We'll
Yeah.
get to the flapping, the flag flapping in a little bit, but I want to concentrate just on the sun and the light source, because as the official narrative will tell you, there is only one light source on the moon, and that is the sun. And that was in part what Bart Sabrile was talking about in his interview on Rumble. He was talking about, the 90-degree lines connecting. But let's first talk about the sun and what you have written about here and what your research involves.
Okay. The main problem with the sun in the Apollo photographs is that it doesn't look like the sun. It's not convincing. There are photographs taken of the sun in low Earth orbit, which is space, about 200 miles up, and the sun always looks the same. It's quite small relative to what's going on, but it has diagonal spokes coming off it, which is an artifact of the camera that took the picture. And that appears in all photographs of the sun taken in space. There were some taken on Apollo 11, and those show these spokes, 8 of them, coming off the sun. And it's quite distinctive, you can see it quite easily, but the photographs taken on the lunar surface of the sun don't show any of that. And that is the major problem. The some that are taken on Apollo 12, there's a series of pictures which include the sun in them. And it really doesn't look particularly convincing. It just looks like a large spotlight.
Now, I want to show the viewer this particular photo here.
That's
Can
right.
you see that, Marcus?
Yeah, I got that. Yeah.
Okay, because I want to ask you something about that photo. That when I look at that, I see a couple of spokes, and I also see a halo around
Yes.
for the viewer out there. I hope I'm showing this. Where is it? Oh, there it is. Okay.
That's the one.
Yeah, if you look at that, is that normal for a camera to pick up a halo like that? Because I don't see that in other photos of the sun.
No.
That's quite, just look at the reflection. It looks like there's a reflection there.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Yeah.
That would be more likely to be the image that a large photographic spotlight would have. Oh,
That's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Just one point we should make really is that none of these photographs could have been taken on the lunar surface. Not one of them. Because we now know that the vacuum level on the moon is so great, Torr 10 to the minus 12, that the film itself, because these are all film images, they're not digital images, they're film images taken on this stuff, which is photographic film. Most people are familiar, well, maybe not so many people now familiar with photographic film, but this is photographic film. This is the material that was used to take every single one of those photographs, because digital cameras hadn't been invented at the time of Apollo. Digital cameras first came along in 1975. The Apollo missions, the alleged Apollo missions, finished in 1972. So one can say with a degree of certainty that every single photograph taken allegedly on the lunar surface was not taken there, it was taken here on Earth. And in order to do that, and one of the problems with that is that nobody really knew, certainly that most people watching would not have known what the lunar surface looked like. We see it in these alleged photographs of the lunar surface, but nobody really knew what they looked like, so they could be assembled in any way that anybody wanted. There had been an unmanned craft called the Lunar Orbiter sent to the moon. It's a reasonable thing to have done, sent to the moon. It was an unmanned craft to photograph possible landing sites for Apollo. This was 1966. And that used photographic film. That particular craft, Lunar Orbiter, used photographic film, which was developed on board the craft using a type of Polaroid system, because Edwin Land, who was the developer of the Polaroid system, was one of the advisors to the contractor building the craft. So it was using photographic film on the moon, or in orbit around the moon. Now, that would imply that photographic film could be used near to the moon, until you realize that the container within the Lunar Orbiter spacecraft that held all the film and the cameras were in a pressurized environment. That's how you avoid vacuum damage to photographic film. We've done the tests. We've done the research. We've used a vacuum chamber. We put a film into that vacuum chamber and then taken photographs with it. And the film is damaged. The color balance is not recorded correctly. It becomes fogged. It reduces the contrast. And the photographs are basically unusable. But every single photograph, there are 5,771 allegedly taken on the lunar surface by the named astronauts. And they were using photographic film in their Hasselblad cameras. It's called Ektachrome, the color film, and Panatomic in the black and white. All photographic film is damaged in a vacuum. So one can say with a degree of certainty that none of the photographs taken on the lunar surface, allegedly taken on the lunar surface, were taken there. They couldn't have been, because when we see all these images on the various websites, and the one I use is the Lunar and Planetary Institute website, purely because its layout is professional and it's easier to use. You look through every single photograph allegedly taken on the lunar surface. There's no color balance damage. There's no fogging on the film. So one can say with a degree of certainty, and if anybody can prove me wrong with this, I want to hear about it, but the photographs were not taken on the lunar surface. They couldn't have been. The photographic film would have been damaged. The cameras were not covered in any form of protection, because they would be visible. We know what the cameras are, the Hasselblad cameras. We know what protection from vacuum would look like, and they're not protected, let alone from the radiation. So every single one of the Apollo photographs was taken here on Earth, probably in a big studio like Hangar 1 at Menlo Park, where a McDonald's restaurant close by it contains hundreds of reels of film. One wonders why that is supposed to be there. What was the purpose in storing them there? Maybe that's where they were filming it. The film, the Tom Hanks film, Apollo 13, part of it was filmed in that Hangar 1, because it's so big. And they used
There's a point.
light.
Yeah, Marcus, before I forget, sorry to interrupt you. Before I forget, I would like you to, for the viewer, you brought up a very, very good point. You're talking about the camera being pressurized versus a non-pressurized camera. Can you tell the viewers how you came across that evidence? You actually came across that evidence on your own. I remember you talking about somebody affiliated with, or some scientist was talking about the photos and said that, and when we were taking photos back in the 60s and 70s, that the camera had to be pressurized. Can you be a little bit more specific about that? Because that is a very key point versus the Hasselblad camera that was brought to the moon that wasn't pressurized, hence talking about the damage to the film that would have occurred, as you and Robert and Scott have talked about many times.
Yeah. I first heard about this problem with photographic film having to be pressurized if used in space. In 2018, when I attended a lecture by the gentleman who had created for NASA the photographic equipment used on the Hexagon spy satellite. That's the KH-9. That used photographic film originally. The Hexagon spy satellite was basically, it was an unmanned satellite orbiting the Earth about 200 miles up, and it was to replace the U-2 spy plane, which had previously been entering Russian airspace to photograph rockets and bombers and various sites. And it got shot down. Gary Powers was the pilot. He was put on trial in Russia. So obviously they couldn't continue flying spy planes over Russia, but they could easily orbit spacecraft because they couldn't be shot down. And anyway, Russia had been doing that themselves when they launched Sputnik in 1957. So they launched Sputnik, and that was flying over America, we know, because people were listening into little beep, beep, beep.
Yeah.
The spacecraft, because the Soviet Union, as it was then, the Russian Federation now, the Soviet Union wanted people to know that it had launched a satellite to orbit the Earth. And in 1961, they launched a man to orbit the Earth, Yuri Gagarin. That was the reason why John Kennedy stood up in the Houses of Congress in Washington and announced, we will land a man on the moon before the decade is out and return him safely to the Earth. They didn't know they could do it. No American had been into space at that point.
No.
So it was a political decision. And the point I usually make about this is that you have to place Apollo in the context of its time. And the context of Apollo, you have to take that into account with the Cold War, the space race, the Vietnam War, the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. America was in a terrible state. They were shooting people on college campuses who were protesting against the Vietnam War. I mean, what's going on? You don't use live bullets on protesters, but they did.
Yeah.
And they killed people. So America were in a real difficulty. So it had to have some good news, and Apollo was the good news. Whether it was real or not was totally irrelevant. It was the good news, and they could create the idea that man had landed on the moon. We now know that he didn't, and he couldn't. And they haven't gone back. This is over 50 years ago. Apollo 11, 1969, we're talking 55 years ago. Extraordinary. I mean, when Charles Lindbergh first flew solo across the Atlantic in 1927, did anybody do it after that? Of course they did. Jumbo jets now carry hundreds of people across the Atlantic every day. It's not even unusual. It's to be expected. So the idea that you can land man on the moon 55 years ago, photograph him on the moon using photographic film, which we know doesn't work in space, is fabrication. It's fraud, actually. It's fraud in the human race. But NASA will never admit that. NASA will never come out and say, okay, guys, sorry, we faked the whole Apollo stuff, and there's a good reason for it. And I would accept that as a reason. I mean, it's a realistic diversionary propaganda. That's what it was. But the idea that they actually did it can now be demonstrated to be fake.
We're in a situation too, Marcus. You would agree we're in a situation here. Well, incidentally, by the way, that incident, that shooting at that university back in 1969, 1970 was actually immortalized in a song by Neil Young. For everybody out there who knows Neil Young, it's a classic to this day. So It was definitely very troubled times for sure. But we're in a situation now where it's reversed. 50 years ago, the technology that we have today worked perfectly, but today the technology we have doesn't seem to work at all, let alone perfectly. It's almost like 50 years ago, the technology, it was better than it is today. Like if today's sophisticated technology can't get manned missions to the moon and back, well, maybe they need to revert back to the better technology was with the analog dials and the, forget about the digital computers, go back to analog and use that. I mean, that's what a person with common sense would say. I mean, let's face it, Mark. It's reversed. Everything's reversed. It's upside down.
Yeah, it is. It is. You're quite right. It's.
Yeah.
I mean, we could do something 55 years ago that we can't do today.
Yeah.
Oh, people say, well, we haven't got the money. We've got money to fight wars, trillions of dollars to fight wars. Apollo didn't cost that much money, and now Elon Musk and SpaceX and Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin are taking over and trying to do it as well, but they're not having much luck either.
No. And let's face it, Marcus, let's face it. And this is a very, very good point, and it's a very valid point, and one that the proponents of the Apollo missions do not like to hear, but they're going to hear it again anyway. NASA is still getting half the funding annually that it was getting back during the Apollo missions. It's around about half. So we're not talking about sending, 6 missions to the moon and back, which they claim they've done, and launching 12 or 13 Saturn V's, which they claim they've done. That would involve the $250 to $300 billion in today's value that it costs to send that. We're talking about just sending one. You have more than enough money and more than enough resources and more than enough technology and more than enough experience. And in other words, more than enough know-how to send one manned mission to the moon and back. But what have we been able to do so far 55 years later? We've been able to send a mission to the moon with mannequins to circle the moon, come back, and then classify the information. And what did I just find out recently? That the actual radiation in the Van Allen belts is classified. It's a military classified. It's a military secret. It's classified. Why is it? And this is a point that Bart Sabrile brought up. Why is it that we can know everything there is to know about the sun, given our capabilities? There's a lot we don't know, but we can release all that information to the public, but we can't release the information from the Van Allen belts, all of it, to the public because it's classified. That tells me only one thing. That tells me they classified it because if they were to release that information, it would be damning proof that the Apollo missions did not happen because you can't get a manned crew through that area of space.
Yeah, you're quite right. You can't. And that's one of the big tragedies, because the current NASA program is called Artemis, and they've launched 2 Artemis program, two launches. One was in December 2014, and it was sent about 3,500 miles out and then came back. So it didn't go to the moon. It didn't come back at lunar orbit return speed either. Came back at 80% of it. And the problem was the heat shield, which is supposed to protect the command module, basically didn't work.
Yeah.
And there are photographs of the heat shield, which is needed to dissipate the heat. It's made of what's called ablative material, which destroys itself and protects the spacecraft behind it. Now, the problem with that is that when the Artemis program sent the second craft out to the moon, as you mentioned, it was just carried dummies on board. Helga and Zohar, they were called, the dummies. And they were to record all these levels of radiation that it would be passing through. And it came back. Now, It's an interesting point because this has never been properly answered. When the excuse me, when the Apollo craft went to the moon, there were two sections of that craft that went to the moon and came back. The command module, in which all the astronauts were on their voyage, alleged voyage to the moon. There were three of them in the command module. Two of them walked, Aldrin and Armstrong on Apollo 11, walked allegedly on the lunar surface. They then came back off the lunar surface, linked up with the command module, ditched their craft that had brought them back from the lunar surface. I've never seen a photograph of that craft which was crashed back onto the moon, allegedly. Never seen a photograph of that. You've seen photographs of the landing sites, well, alleged photographs of the alleged landing sites. When they link up with the command module, which is in orbit around the moon, in the case of Apollo 11, that was Michael Collins, was lunar module command pilot. They link up and they come back to Earth. But the command module is attached to the service module, which is basically a larger part. It's a cylindrical craft which held all the consumables, like the water, the electricity generation, the fuel cells and so on, and the camera equipment as well, photographic equipment to photograph the lunar surface. That all came back to Earth. Now you enter Earth's atmosphere at the speed you leave it at, or the speed you leave Earth's gravity at, 25,000 miles an hour. If you're orbiting Earth, you're traveling at 17,000 miles an hour, 17,500 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Quite a lot slower. And the heat generated as the craft enters the Earth's atmosphere, which is only 60 miles up, that's where it enters the Earth's atmosphere. It generates a lot of heat. But in order to use the command module's heat shield, it has to be separated from the service module, which is below it. Now, how are those two items, the command module and the service module, how are they attached together when it's flying in space? And they're launched together on the Saturn V rocket. A lot of the Saturn V rocket is discarded, but the service module and the command module go to the moon together. How are they linked together? How are they connected together? With 6 large steel bolts which attach the command module to the service module. How do you separate those two craft as you enter Earth's atmosphere? You use explosive bolts to break the link, but these bolts go through the heat shield. They have to go through the heat shield. That's the way they link them together.
Yep.
Now, when they break those links, you've got to do them all at once, all at the same time, otherwise you spin the craft. Let's assume they got that right. What do you do about the holes that are in the heat shield where the bolts go through? What do you do about that? Well, you have little pads. They're called compression pads, which are supposed to seal those holes. Now, that's dangerous, because if you remember what happened with the Columbia space shuttle,
yeah,
it got damaged on its launch. A big block of ice fell off and damaged the heat shield on the space shuttle. That broke up as it entered Earth's atmosphere, because the heat generated got through to the structure of the craft itself. The whole thing disintegrated over Texas, as it happened. So we know that damaging a heat shield is very risky. It's not something that you can tolerate. It has to be totally foolproof. I don't believe they were totally foolproof, because when the heat shield on the Artemis on the Orion spacecraft, which is Apollo 2.0, was examined after it had returned unmanned from lunar orbit, the heat shield had great chunks missing out of it. I mean, not just burning off, it had chunks missing.
Yeah.
And you can see where the bolts that were separated, because that had a service module as well. They had to be separated as well. You can see where the bolts went through. And the reports indicate that those bolts were not properly covered. And that's why it was, if there'd been humans on board, they'd almost certainly have been at severe risk of being fried, basically. So
And they had no way, they had no mechanism or any way of making a determination whether it's safe to enter. And it wasn't safe to enter, they were doomed anyway, but they would have no mechanism. So I guess their reason would be, well, there would be nothing they can do about it, but it worked perfectly. 10 launches. It worked perfectly every time. That's what we're told.
Yeah. Worked perfectly.
Yeah. And they did a total of, I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, because I've been away from the details for quite a while, but I think it was 3 or 4 unmanned launches, including Apollo 4 and Apollo 6.
Yeah.
Actually 2. I don't think the 2 previous tests before those launches were actual Apollo command modules, but let's go with Apollo 4 and Apollo 6.
Yeah.
Is there any data on the re-entry of those 2 unmanned command modules when they were entering, specifically talking about the bolts here? And for the viewers out there, I just want you to see what happened here. We got so, when we're talking about chapter 9, and it just leads into so many other areas, we can't help, but that's just the way this subject goes, right? We'll get back to that in a moment, but is there any data specific to what you were just talking about regarding the reentry of Apollo 4 and Apollo 6? Well, actually, even Apollo 5, Apollo 4, Apollo 5, and Apollo 6. They were unmanned missions. Any data specific to that topic you were just talking about?
Not that I've been able to find.
Yeah, that'd be a very significant piece of data, wouldn't it?
It would be, yes, but of course,
because it's make or break.
Apollo 4, 5, and 6 were only returning from Earth orbit.
Yeah.
The first one to return from lunar orbit was Apollo 8.
Yes.
And
even more significant. Even more significant. Yeah.
Apollo 8, that was the first manned mission alleged to the moon. And that returned quite safely, and the astronauts are all okay. There's no problem there. And then you have Apollo 9, which was a Saturn I launch. That was Earth orbit as well. Apollo 10 was a practice.
Actually, I'm not sure. I thought Apollo 9 was a Saturn. You say Saturn 1. I thought it was a Saturn 5 because my understanding is that they checked the they supposedly launched that to do a full check on the lunar module, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they did.
I think it was Apollo 5 launch.
Okay, yeah. Certainly, if it carried the lunar module, it would almost certainly be a Saturn V launch.
But it was only, you're right. It was only in Earth orbit. It didn't leave, and it was a manned mission. It did not leave Earth orbit. So you're right. Yeah. So it was Apollo 5 launch.
Yeah, and then Apollo 10 was a lunar orbit, but it didn't land. Then Apollo 11 and so on. Excuse me. So there are a lot of launches. They were relatively close together.
Yeah.
I mean, this was it's after they redesigned the command module after the Apollo 1 fire, because the Apollo 1 command module had a door through which the astronauts would enter the craft, had a door which opened inwards.
Yeah.
So if there's increased pressure inside the craft, they couldn't get the door open. It had to open outwards, like aircraft doors.
Yes.
Go on an aircraft, the door always opens outwards. And it's because there's pressure inside an aircraft, in the same way there's pressure inside the command module,
Yeah.
It has to be quite strong. It has to be big bolts to hold it to the fuselage. And we saw what happened when one of Boeing's planes had a blowout of a part of the door.
Yeah.
Not very.
Yeah, that was scary.
Yeah, I bet it was.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've got all these problems with the command module where the astronauts are, and they always appear to be quite successful returns. But if you look at the mechanics of a command module returning to Earth, whether it's in Earth orbit or lunar orbit,
yeah,
it starts using the heat shield comes into use when it hits the Earth's atmosphere. Now, the Earth's atmosphere is only 60 miles up. It's called the Kármán line, where the atmosphere basically finishes and space begins. It isn't quite as dramatic as that, because the atmosphere from the Earth drifts off into space. There's bits of it around. But the main part of the atmosphere, which is held onto Earth by the gravity of Earth, that's 60 miles up. So if you're coming back from space at 25,000 miles an hour, and you can only start to slow down once you hit the Earth's atmosphere, you hit it at a very, very acute angle. It's 6.5 degrees to the Earth's surface, which means that you then travel through the atmosphere, slowing down, for about 1,000 miles, maybe even longer, 1,200 miles. Because that gives you time to burn off the heat. I mean, burn off is a correct term, because you are burning it off.
Yeah.
The heat shield is supposed
dissipating.
Dissipate. That's a good word.
Yeah.
It dissipates the energy, the kinetic energy, from 25,000 miles an hour, which is what it enters the atmosphere at, to about 200 miles an hour, then the parachutes can be deployed. And the parachutes are deployed about 3 or 4 miles high.
Your love's just like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line